Welcome back. Let's get started with the DoD approach to funding. All right, so let's start this out by considering different types of funders. I'm going to put them in two categories. And now these are examples here. We're not going to put all federal funders on a slide. We're not even going to try to do that. But let's just get into some examples here. Okay, so we could have community-driven organizations. And classic examples of this would be National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health. What other type of funders do we have? Well, we have mission-driven funders. So this would be DoD, DOE, EPA, or ARPA-H, for example. Okay, so now the important thing to remember about these is that both types can support basic research. And this is a course that's focused on getting your basic research funded. Well, we'll talk about some organizations that do a bit more applied research too, but really the core of what we're talking about here is basic research. So if you're in the business of basic research, which I think you are, you definitely want to understand what the difference is between community-driven and mission-driven organizations. And this is going to help you be successful in both types of organization. And clearly, for what I explain here, I hope that it does not sound like I'm favoring one style of doing things over another. I think what we'll see as we go through examples of how these different approaches to a funding a strategy play out is that they complement each other, right? There's strengths, if you want to call them strengths, or weaknesses to each kind of approach. And I don't even know if it's really fair to call them strengths and weaknesses as much as differences. So we're going to see what those differences are. So let's go ahead and look at those right here. All right, so in a community-driven organization versus a mission-driven organization, what are some of the ways they differ? All right, so first of all, the funding strategy is generally guided by the scientific community. That's what community-driven means. Whereas with mission-driven, the funding strategy is going to be determined by the organization itself. This is a very big difference in the two. Now, a community-driven organization usually is going to be mostly basic research. There's still applied research that's supported at NSF and other funders, but it leans more towards being basic research oriented. And the mission-driven organizations support basic research. They can support applied research. They can support a mix of basic and applied research. So just keep that in mind. Now, the big thing here that I'm going to focus on the most is how decisions are made, because making decisions is a very important part of getting funded, right? It all comes down to a decision in the end, or a series of decisions, right? So we want to understand the decision-making process. And that's why I have this here in the red color, is because I'm going to have a slide on the next slide where I break this down in more detail. So we'll get into it there. But largely, there will be consensus-based decisions, a consensus-based decision-making process that is employed in a community-driven organization, whereas in a mission-driven organization, you will have more individual-based decisions. That is where there is an individual who in the end can make a call to say, yes, I recommend this, no, I don't recommend this, and this will be more prevalent than in a community-driven organization. Now, this is not to say that there's not individual-based decision-making that happens in a community-driven organization. That would often happen when decisions are for a lower dollar amount. You may not need a big consensus around something when it's, say, a 40K award, right? Same thing in a mission-driven organization when there is a large a decision being made regarding a large amount of money, like something like a Muri, which they're now over $7 million. There will be a panel, there will be a committee of some kind that comes together and generates a consensus around that decision. So this is not in any way black and white, but this is a very important thing to understand so that you can start to have success with DoD funding. A community-driven organization, because it's driven by the community of scientists who are in departments that are organized, around traditional disciplines at their institution, it makes sense that the organization of these orgs will somewhat mirror that. And so what that means is it can be relatively easy to find your home. But then again, that's the good part, right? But then again, we have those silos between disciplines. So again, I'm not saying it's good or bad. These are just differences. And for the mission-driven funders, we can find that they are not organized by traditional discipline. They may be organized by application area, for example. And, here, when we talk about what else a funder is trying to achieve besides the technical aims, there can be aims towards workforce development, towards community engagement, all kinds of other, say, non-technical aims. And you will find in a community-driven organization that it's usually pretty straightforward to find out what those are, and you're generally not going to be surprised by them either, because those are the aims that we're all talking about as a society, so they're not going to seem like they're coming out of left field. In contrast, what else the mission-driven funder is trying to achieve with their funding strategy, besides just the technical knowledge, right, that they'll gain through funding the research, is something, again, like the strategy overall, that you may not really have a way to become aware of as an outsider to that organization, and not in any way because it's necessarily a secret, but because these are things that are going to be more specific to that organization. Like perhaps they have a very narrow area of research or expertise where they need workforce development to happen. And again, that may not be something that is secret or sensitive in any way at all, but if you're not part of that organization, you just may not know that there's a particular challenge that they are trying to address through some of the funding they do. But these are the things that you absolutely can find out by just having a conversation with somebody. So my point here is that when you see an announcement from a mission-driven funder, the information that you'll see there is accurate, but there may be more behind the story that you would benefit from knowing, because these could be issues that you could be able to address with your research or with your team or with something else that you do. So now, as I think I said on the last slide, okay, these are generalizations. So you're going to be able to find examples where all this does not necessarily play out this way in a community-driven organization, and vice versa. In a mission-driven org, I already gave you an example of like a Muri panel of a group of people coming to make a decision on a recommendation for Muri, a winner for a Muri award. So this, however, even though it's not going to hold true 100% of the time, it does generally hold true a good portion of the time, and this context, I believe, will be very helpful and in fact is really necessary for you to have success, because again, we want to understand the why behind all of this. So I did say that the consensus-based versus individual-based decision-making processes are very important to understand. So that is why we are breaking this out on this slide here. Okay, so big one here is risk tolerance. Whenever you have a group of people coming together and they are going to agree to something that is a consensus that is going to lean away from favoring risk, that is going to be end up being a more risk averse group, or a group decision is more risk averse than perhaps an individual based one. The individual based decision and the tolerance to risk that you will find there is going to depend on the individual. So if the individual themselves is risk averse, then that individual could favor things that are risk averse. If that individual has a high tolerance to risk, then they could put something forward where there is a lot of, relatively high level of risk or perceived risk. So this is a very, very important point to keep in mind as we move through this course. Now, this is another one, okay, perceived fairness. So now, how does this come into play in the decision-making process? So when there is a consensus around a decision, people will generally feel, for example, in a panel, even if they don't fully agree with the comments from the panel, even if they get inconsistent comments, from year to year because it's a different panel or maybe even a similar panel on a proposal. But they generally will feel that there was an objective process for the evaluation and that there was some kind of oversight of that process and that there was a pretty close to a direct comparison, if not actually a direct comparison, among the different proposals that were competing for funding. On the other hand, when you are making a decision as an individual, and of course these decisions are informed by evaluations from subject matter experts, etc., but at the end of the day, it could be an individual who makes the recommendation or not to fund something. It can be harder to know exactly what was going on in that one person's mind, right? Because they're making that decision on their own. They're not doing it in a group. So this means it can be more of a black box. And when something seems like a black box, then we can easily assume that perhaps it's not fair. Even though I do believe that the decisions are fair that are made in an individual-based decision-making process, because there are, like I said, evaluations that are factored into these decisions. There is oversight, but again, it's not as always, all parts of it are not as out in the open. So I alluded to this next one here already, but when you have a panel and you have any kind of group of proposals that are being evaluated together, they are effectively in a direct competition, whereas when you have, say, rolling deadlines and things coming in and being evaluated by ad hoc or mail-in reviewers, right, not panels, one-offs we could call the review process. Also, we could consider the proposals in a sense a one-off. And what this means is that in a consensus-based process, you could be considering apples to apples to apples, right? Whereas when you're on a rolling situation with the timeline and really one-off evaluations and even proposals that can be coming in on even more variation in terms of the subject matter that they could be addressing, the topics of the proposals could actually be quite different. And that could be the case in an NSF panel type process as well, but they could be even more different perhaps with the mission-driven funder. And so that's why I like this picture of a cornucopia here, is because this could represent the individual decision maker is trying to decide among, even the fact that these fruits and other vegetables here are, of course, they have different identities, right? There's a lot of different types of fruits and foods represented here, and they're also different sizes. So I think that actually makes a good analogy too, because there could be like the little garlic there that's being considered for a 40K conference award, and then you could have that big pumpkin, which is a $2 million award, and someone can be making a decision to put all of these pieces together and figure out, like, what is my strategy going to be for funding this next year. And whereas in the other situation, we had more of an apples to apples to apples type case. So I hope that the illustration is helpful there. Now, the role of the manager is also different in a consensus versus an individual-based decision-making process. When you're talking about a consensus, the manager still has a very important role, but they will be effectively in more of a documentation and reporting out type role to record the conversations that were had, the debates that were had, the decisions that were made, and then why those decisions were made the way they were, to summarize that and report out on that. Whereas the manager in the individual-based decision-making process may have a lot more authority and autonomy to make a recommendation on their own. So this is a very different role of the manager in these two situations. Now, related to that, the level of standardization and flexibility in the process can vary greatly. When you have apples to apples to apples and there's a hard deadline and things are being evaluated in a batch, like a basket of apples, you very well may not have flexibility in terms of coming back with more information, making your case, responding to reviewers, scoping something down. In the other type of process, because you're not in a direct competition with another proposal, you may have the opportunity to, again, provide extra information, to make a stronger case for yourself if there's questions that you might have a chance to answer without having to wait and do a resubmission. Or you may not. In some programs, there's more flexibility, in some there's not, but you may have a hope of getting, a second chance, without having to do a resubmission. So, all right, we're gonna get into now the fun part here. So, what makes getting DoD funding easier? Okay, so when we talk about the relatively higher acceptance rates that can exist in some DoD programs compared to, say, NSF, I believe that there is generally, and again, I'm talking in generalizations because there's many different programs out there, at any of these orgs. More vetting at the pre-proposal stage can happen, and I believe does happen, with a lot of the DoD programs, so that someone can tell you right off the bat, that looks like a very interesting idea, but it does not appear to fit my program. And this is something that can be very helpful for you to learn, because it could save you from writing an entire proposal for something that doesn't have a good chance of being supported. And again, going back to an individual who could make that determination and communicate that to you at an early stage, that is something that, again, while it could be disappointing to learn that, I believe it's a good thing. This means that when the proposals do come in, if they have already kind of weeded out the ones that are not a strong fit for the program, then the ones that remain that come in, those ideas, they should have a relatively higher success rate as proposals, So you could feel that when I'm writing this proposal, I really don't feel like I have no idea what's going to happen to it. I actually have had conversations with people, and I feel like there's a good chance that, in fact, it could be supported. So I can just feel better about putting my time into this. Now, this goes back to the last slide. We're going to have less reliance on consensus decision-making. So if you can find a strong advocate for your idea, you may not have to convince many, many more people that it's a good idea. So this can also make things easier. Also, there are fewer hard boundaries between the disciplines. So if you're getting that situation where someone's saying, well, this doesn't fit my program, go talk to that program. Well, you go talk to that program, they say, well, we don't do that, DoD could be a place where you don't get that response automatically or as easily. So this could make that idea certainly easier to get funded. However, big caveat here, if you are submitting blind without having the conversations that I suggest that you have and that we're going to talk about in the upcoming lessons, you are not going to benefit from these advantages. So I want to say that again, because that's very important. If you are submitting without having any conversations with anyone, you're just reading an announcement and submitting a proposal, you will not benefit from any of these advantages. And in fact, I believe that your chances will actually be lower or worse than they would be with other funders. So this is one of our keys here. This is very important. Your chances with DoD can actually be higher, but you have to go through all of the process that I outlined on the timeline slide in the last lesson, the whole research funding process, all of those stages you need to be getting the information, taking the actions and making the next steps all along that process. If you do all of that and you in the end have someone encouraging you to submit a proposal, I believe that your chances to get funded will be higher than they would be at, say, let's just say NSF, realizing that there's many different programs there, etc. But if you do not do any of that, you simply read a solicitation, you come up in your own mind with what you think would be a good research idea to address that. You don't run that by anyone. You don't do a pre-proposal stage process. You submit that. I think your odds of getting funded will actually be lower. So this is an important key. Now, I would just like to touch here on some higher level considerations that I don't think we need to worry about for this course, but I do want to mention them because they can be on people's minds. And this is, what about different administrations when they come in or go out, right? And someone says, oh, now we're going to focus on this topical area. It's going to be very important. So we're going to ramp up our investments in this. Now, I have been in geosciences for 20 years now, so we've been through many administrations where we had a focus on climate change research, and then some other administration came in and said we were going to de-emphasize that type of research, and then another administration would come in and say we are going to ramp up efforts in that area. So this is very common, and we can assume that these kinds of changing priorities will continue to happen. So what does this mean in terms of your following the news, following politics perhaps, to learn, where is the opportunity going to be in the future? So good news for you. I believe that you do not need to worry about this. When something like a new executive order comes down, this is going to take time to trickle down through the bureaucracy and reach an organization. And importantly here, this first bullet, so when that finally does, that guidance, does come down, there's still going to be the same staff at the organization, because the only people who change out in these agencies are very high level people, which are these political appointees that come in and come out. And you're generally not going to be dealing with anyone in those positions. You're going to be dealing with what they call career civil servants. So these folks will stay the same with one administration, with another administration. And that this is not to get off on a tangent, but this is, in my opinion, a good thing for the bureaucracy, because it keeps things stable, right? And it keeps things running with people that have institutional knowledge, and things don't swing too quickly one way or another. So what this means, though, is that even if a program gets a different name, or even if it's has somewhat of a reduced budget or an increased budget, the person who is managing it, or who is maybe assigned to a new portfolio, is going to remain the same. So when you have a relationship with that person, and that is a contact that you can reach out to, that is going to provide consistency for you. So my point is that you don't need to worry about this. There are people at a high level in your institution who do worry about this kind of thing. The administration priorities and things like that, trends that happen on the time scale of decades. These are things that inform big decisions like building, a new center or a school on your campus, doing a hire of 20 or 30 new faculty to address a certain topical area. This is not the kind of stuff that you need to worry about. So I am gonna leave it at that, and I will see you in the next lesson, where we will go over the DoD funding organizations.